Evening, everybody. My name is Sabir, pronouns he, him, and I direct events here at the Strand. Before we launch into this afternoon's discussion of Maggie O'Farrell's novel Hamnet, I'd like to share a little bit of history about the Strand. The Strand was founded in 1927 by Benjamin Bass over on 4th Avenue's Book Row. Stretching from Union Square to Astor Place, Book Row gradually dwindled from 48 bookstores until, after 93 years, the Strand is the sole survivor, now run by third generation owner Nancy Bass Wyden. We want to thank all of you for your support. Without our loyal community of book lovers and authors such as Maggie and Brandon, we wouldn't be here today, and we are truly so appreciative of it. So, tonight we are thrilled to have with us Maggie O'Farrell for the paperback launch of her novel, Hamnet, a novel of the plague. Maggie O'Farrell was born in Northern Ireland in 1972. She grew up in Wales and Scotland and now lives in Edinburgh. She is the author of The Hand That First Held Mine, winner of the Coastal Novel Award, Instructions for a Heat Wave, This Must Be the Place, and most recently, I Am, 17 Brushes with Death. Joining Maggie in conversation tonight is Brandon Taylor. Brandon is the author of the acclaimed novel Real Life, which has been shortlisted for the Booker Prize, longlisted for the Center for Fiction's first novel prize, and named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. He holds graduate degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the University of Iowa, where he was an Iowa Arts Fellow at the Iowa Writers Workshop in Fiction. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Maggie and Brandon to the stage.
Should we wait for a bit or shall I just go ahead?
Yeah, I think it's safe to go ahead, and then as people will join, we'll make sure they have access to the recording so they can see the beginning of the reading.
Okay, good. Okay, well, I will start. I will read from the beginning of the book, which is where Hamnet, who's 11 years old, is running around the house where he lives in Stratford-upon-Avon because he is looking for someone to help his twin sister who's fallen ill. And he's just come across his grandfather. The room is filled with gloom, coverings pulled over most of the windows. His grandfather is standing with his back towards him in a crouched position, fumbling with something. Papers, a cloth bag, counters of some sort. There is a pitcher on the table and a cup. His grandfather's hand meanders through these objects, his head bent, his breath coming in wheezing bursts. Hamnet gives a polite cough. His grandfather wheels around, his face wild, furious, his arms flailing through the air as if warding off an assailant. "Who's there?" he cries. "It's me, Hamnet." His grandfather sits down with a thud. "You scared the wits out of me," he cries. "Whatever do you mean, creeping about like that?" "I'm sorry," Hamnet says. "I was calling and calling, but no one answered. Judith is unwell and they've gone out." His grandfather speaks over him with a curt flick of his wrist. "What do you want with all those women anyway?" He seizes the neck of the pitcher and aims it towards the cup. The liquid, ale, Hamnet thinks, slops out precipitously, some into the cup and some onto the papers on the table, causing his grandfather to curse, then dab at them with his sleeve. For the first time, it occurs to Hamnet that his grandfather might be drunk. "Do you know where they've gone?" Hamnet asks. "Eh?" his grandfather says, still mopping his papers. His anger at their spoiling seems to unsheath itself and stretch out from him like a rapier. Hamnet can feel the tip of it wander about the room, seeking an opponent. "Don't stand there gawping," his grandfather hisses. "Help me." Hamnet shuffles forward a step, then another. He is wary, his father's words circling his mind. Stay away from your grandfather when he's in one of his black humours. Be sure to stand clear of him. Stay well back, do you hear? His father had said this to him on his last visit, when they'd been helping unload a cart from the tannery. John, his grandfather, had dropped a bundle of skins into the mud and, in a sudden fit of temper, had hurled a paring knife at the yard wall. His father had immediately pulled Hamnet back, behind him, out of the way, but John had barged past them into the house without a word. His father had taken Hamlet's face in both of his hands, fingers curled in at the nape of his neck, his gaze steady and searching. "He'll not touch your sisters, but it's you I worry for," he had muttered, his brow puckering. "You know the humour I mean, don't you?" Hamlet had nodded, but wanted the moment to be prolonged, for his father to keep holding his head like that. It gave him a sensation of lightness, of safety, of being entirely known and treasured. "Swear to me," his father had said, as he stood in the yard, his voice hoarse. "Swear it. I need to know you'll be safe when I'm not here to see to it." Hamlet believes he is keeping his word. He is well back. He is at the other side of the fireplace. His grandfather couldn't reach him here, even if he tried. His grandfather is draining his cup with one hand and shaking the drops off a sheet of paper with the other. "Take this," he orders, holding out the page. Hamlet bends forward, not moving his feet, and takes it with the very tips of his fingers. His grandfather's eyes are slitted, watchful. His tongue pokes out of the side of his mouth. He sits in his chair, hunched, an old, sad toad on a stone. "And this," his grandfather holds out, another paper. Hamlet bends forward in the same way, keeping the necessary distance. He thinks of his father, how he would be proud of him, how he would be pleased. Quick as a fox, his grandfather makes a lunge. Everything happens so fast that afterwards Hamlet won't be sure in what sequence it all occurred. The page swings to the floor between them. His grandfather's hand seizes him by the wrist, by the elbow, hauling him forwards into the gap, the necessary space his father had told him to observe. And the other hand, which still holds the cup, is coming up fast. Hamlet is aware of streaks in his vision, red, orange, the colours of fire, before he feels the pain. It is a sharp, clubbed, jabbing pain. The rim of the cup has struck him just below the eyebrow. "That'll teach you," his grandfather says in a calm voice, "to creep up on people. Thank you."
Oh my gosh. Ah, chills, 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 chills. Oh my gosh. I I have a very visceral memory of that particular passage because I I was like walking around in my apartment reading it and I like jabbed my toe on the corner of the door just as I got to that part. So I it is emblazoned in my memory. Maggie, I loved this book. It's such a thrill to get to talk to you about it. My first question, and I promised the internet that I would ask you this. How do we revive William Shakespeare so that I can murder him with my bare hands? He was so awful to poor Agnes. I am furious.
That's really interesting. And no one else has said that to me. That's very interesting. I mean, I really tried, I think, with the book, not to come down on either side in their marriage. I think their marriage has been open to so much speculation over the last 400 years. Everybody seems to have piled on to say their marriage was this, it was that. I mean, mainly people have been so determined to push the single narrative that their marriage was really unhappy, that he, was trapped into marriage age 18 by this older woman who had the nerve to get pregnant. And, we've always been told that, scholars will give us that narrative, biographers, other novelists, writers of Oscar-winning screenplays. We've been constantly told this, that he regretted this marriage, that he ran away to London to get away from her, that he couldn't wait. That's why he left to London. He had to stay away, and I don't believe a word of it, actually. I've never found a single shred of evidence. I think actually their marriage, I mean, yes, probably was a bit unconventional because he, obviously he was working away in London a lot. But I don't believe that he ran away to London to get away from her. And I don't believe that he left behind, and I do understand why biographers and scholars focus on his life in London. Obviously, that's where the story is, isn't it? That's where the important things happen. But I've always felt that the most important thing, the biggest drama, if you like, in Shakespeare's life happened off stage. And that is the death of his son in Stratford-upon-Avon. And the thing that, people will always bring up the second best bed behest, the famous behest in his will. And so many detractors of his wife will say, this proves that he didn't love her. He doesn't show her any affection in the will. But actually, if you look at the will, there's no sign of any affection to anybody. I mean, you wouldn't think that the person who wrote this document is the same person who wrote probably the greatest lines we've ever known about love in all its forms. But, I mean, let's be fair, the man was dying, probably of typhoid, which, and I don't know about you, Brandon, but I don't feel particularly, inspired when I'm lying on my bed, very sick. But actually, what's important, I think, is that speaks louder to me than the second best bet. At the end of his career, when he retired from the stage, he was the equivalent of a multimillionaire. He was an incredibly good businessman, and he could have set up household anywhere, but he chose to go back to Stratford-upon-Avon to live with her, which, you know, and that to me speaks volumes. You know, it speaks a lot louder than anyone who's going to talk about the second best bed or the fact that she had the nerve to be pregnant when they got married, you know. So I suppose I wanted to ask readers to forget everything they think they know about Mrs. Shakespeare and about their marriage, and to say, you know, perhaps they did love each other, perhaps it was a partnership, perhaps they, you know, it was a love match. I think it was.
Yeah, and the love is so palpable in the novel. I feel that the love between them radiates so purely and so brightly, which is of course why I was so furious at the end when he comes back with that bracelet and, you know, Agnes is like, "What is he doing in London?" And I'm like, "What is he doing in London? How dare he betray Agnes?" And, you know, I was so like attached to Agnes by that point that I was like ready to fight anyone who was even a little unfair and unjust to her. But I think that you do this incredible job of writing about these people as though they were people first. Like you so deeply inhabit the sort of singular, anxious humanity of all these characters. And we do so readily forget that they were, you know, William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway. We forget all of that. And we, for the span of this novel, just live with these characters. And so, you know, one forgets that Shakespeare is the Shakespeare of Macbeth. And suddenly he's just this guy in London while his family is grieving.
Well, that's so nice. I'm so pleased that you liked it. You know, when I was writing the book, I was very apprehensive, you know, about writing a novel about Shakespeare. You know, who does that? Why would anyone do that? And that was my main sort of vertigo before I even wrote the book. And while I was writing it, I was just thinking, you know, who would choose to write fiction about William Shakespeare? So that's partly why I don't use his name, you know, because I think, and probably more than any other name in the whole world, it's the one that's probably most well known. I would venture to claim that. I think, you know, you'd be hard pressed anywhere in the world to find somebody over the age of, say, 11 who hasn't heard of him, you know, who doesn't know who he is. So the name, you know, it's more than a name. It carries so much weight, heft, and significance that actually I just needed to divorce it from the person, because I wanted people to see him as a human being, as a father, as a young man, as a you know, a brother or a husband or whatever. So, and also actually the other reason is that I literally could not sit down at my computer or my notebook and write a sentence like William Shakespeare walked up the path and knocked on the door. You know, I instantly felt like an Egypt, and I thought, well, if I can't stay submerged in this narrative as the writer, I can't expect readers to do it either. So I just thought I'll just do away with it all. Which was, you know, I mean, in a kind of technical sense, it was, at times it was quite a stretch, because it is I had to kind of, there were a few scenes, particularly actually where I had two male characters interacting, so scenes with him and his father, or there's one scene where he gets into a kind of argument with Agnes's brother, and actually those scenes in a sort of technical, grammatical, semantic sense were really tricky, because I had to kind of keep twisting and bending the language to sort of bend it around the idea that he didn't have a name, because if you've got two male pronouns and one of them you can't use his name, you do get yourself tangled up in knots. So in that way it was an interesting exercise.
Yeah, well, since we're on the topic of names, in the novel, names have this kind of totemic force, and I think the most obvious example is the fact that Shakespeare is not named. We don't use his name in the book. And also Hamnet's name becomes this powerful, almost incantatory motif at the end of the book, where, you know, the famous play is written and suddenly, you know, Agnes is in the audience watching people say her son's name, and it's really sort of painful for her. I guess and then there's the fact of, you know, certain people's names are given back to them, your sort of corrective of calling her Agnes instead of Anne, that sort of thing. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the power of names and how you approached them in the book, and your reasons and methodology for naming characters as you did.
Well, to me, the novel its central theme is names, really. I mean, the book came out of my questions about the name of Hamlet. You know, I first heard of Little Hamlet Shakespeare when I was 16, and I was at school and we were studying the play Hamlet. And I had a really fantastic English teacher at school, and the play really got under my skin in a way that nothing else had really before. I think Hamlet as a character does appeal to a certain type of adolescent who wears a lot of black, and maybe in my case, much too much black eyeliner. And I just felt as though he was part of my family. He felt like we shared the same DNA as a character. And then my teacher just mentioned in passing one day that Shakespeare had a son who was called Hamnet, who had died about 4 or 5 years before he went on to write the play Hamlet. And I have a really strong memory of looking down at the cover of the school issue play on my desk and just putting my finger over the L and taking it off again and just thinking, well, it's the same name, you know, what does that mean? And when I went to university, I studied literature, and obviously, you know, I read a lot about Shakespeare, and we were reading a lot of theory and critical theory and analysis about it. And I was just amazed, actually, that Hamlet never came into it. Everybody was he was completely off topic. He was completely consigned to a literary footnote, and you'd read these big sort of 500-page biographies of Shakespeare, and Hamlet was lucky if he got maybe 2 mentions. You know, they mentioned that he and Judith were born, they mentioned that he died, and then a lot of biographers or scholars about, you know, Shakespearean scholars would say, you know, it's impossible to know whether or not Shakespeare was thinking of his dead son when he wrote the play Hamlet. You know, as even as I'm saying that line, it makes me laugh, because I just think, what? Are you serious? You know, what are you talking about? You know, what person would likely take, you know, because I should say actually that in Elizabethan times, spelling was of course a lot less stable, and they are actually the same name. They are completely, Hamnet and Hamlet are interchangeable in parish records. In fact, Hamnet Shakespeare was called after his godfather, who was the baker, and he and both Judith were called after their godparents, who were Hamnet and Judith Sadler, who were obviously friends of the Shakespeares. And Hamnet Sadler, who's the godfather, spells his name all different ways. He spells it with an L, he does it with an N, he spells it with 2 T's, with 1 T. You know, it's all just up for grabs in those days. So it is the same name. And just the idea of somebody taking the name of their quite recently dead child just casually and putting it in play. I mean, obviously it's ridiculous. You know, the idea that Shakespeare would have to write that name over and over again in the manuscript, and he'd have to hear it constantly over and over again during rehearsals of the play, and then he'd have to speak it himself during, you know, the initial production of Hamlet on stage at the Globe. I mean, nobody would do that lightly. Nobody would just casually use that name. You know, imagine speaking it, because there is a story that he did take, Shakespeare himself took the role of the ghost in the first production of Hamlet at the Globe. And the idea that you'd speak this name to, you know, this audience of thousands of people who have no idea it's of its significance to you, it is ridiculous, you know. So it just always seemed to me that little Hamnet has never been given his due. He's been silenced, he's been sidelined. And so I wanted to write this book. You know, it came out of a kind of passion and a sort of fury, in a sense. You know, I wanted to give this boy a presence and a voice and say he was important. You know, this child, his life was short, but he was grieved, his parents loved him. And he was significant to us as an audience, because I don't think that without him we would have Hamlet, and I don't think we would have Twelfth Night. But in terms of, so we've talked about why I divorced Will from his name. But the name, you know, the woman we've been taught to call Annie was Shakespeare, obviously. But one of the things was, one of the documents I read was her father's will when I was researching the book. So her father, Richard Hathaway, was quite a well-to-do sheep farmer. He was a yeoman and a sheep farmer. And I read his will, and in his will, he died a year before they got married. She married William. And in the will, he leaves her quite a generous dowry, and he refers to her as my daughter Agnes. And and it was a kind of a lightning bolt moment for me, because I just thought, hang on, wait a minute, who's Agnes? And I read the thing and I thought, no, he's referring to his eldest daughter. So it just seems to me that maybe on top of everything else, of all the misunderstanding that we've had about her, we've probably been calling her by the wrong name for 400 years. You know, I mean, because surely if anyone knows her real name, it would be her father. And of course, Agnes, the name, is Latin for lamb. And you think a man who is a sheep farmer, he gives that name to his eldest daughter, you know, that's really, it's a really heartfelt gesture that, but it just seemed to me emblematic, because she is someone who has been so badly treated by history and so poorly treated by scholarship. We know so little about her. I mean, we actually know very little about Shakespeare himself. We only have 6 examples of his signature. In a sort of imbalance, we have this enormous wealth of his work, only thanks to his friends who published it, not no thanks to him. But by contrast, there's very little known about him. His biography is very sketchy. There are all sorts of gaps and longueurs in it. But his wife, we know even less about. There's no record even of her birth. But it hasn't stopped scholars from rushing forward, and historians and other writers, to fill that gap with sort of opprobrium and hatred and vilification and criticism and actually just downright barefaced misogyny. We've been taught constantly that she is this ignorant peasant woman who lured this boy genius into marriage. And I don't think that's true. But it just felt right to me to give this name to her, to sort of signal to readers that, I want them to forget everything they think they know about Anne Hathaway and open themselves up to a new interpretation. And this is someone you haven't yet met. This is Agnes.
And what a first encounter with Agnes. She's this, I mean, she, to my mind, is one of the most memorable characters in modern fiction. I think she's going to stay with me for a very long time. I mean, those early passages we get with her where she's with the bees and she's minding her hives and she's just out in nature. I mean, she is just this incredible character, and I don't know, I get chills just thinking about her. But that leads me to ask, the novel has some obvious resonances and relations to real people and the real record and the archive, etc. And so I'm curious, about how you make the leap from the sort of skeletal facts of the archive to this deeply imagined work of fiction, and what are some of the challenges and thrills in that process, and also what were some of the surprises that you encountered in your research? I mean, Agnes's name being one, but what were some of the other exciting tidbits that you unearthed in your research?
I mean, the thing is, the Shakespeare story has been absolutely gone over with a fine-tooth comb. In the intervening 400 years, the world's best Shakespearean scholars have been over every single minutiae and document. I mean, everything you could possibly imagine. You could spend the rest of your life reading about Shakespeare if you wanted to. The number of books written about him is jaw-dropping. I mean, I've read most of them, and it took me a long time. But so in that sense, that part of the story is very well combed out. I mean, and I know, and I think that people are maybe still finding things out about him. There's been an exhaustive search for his library. People have been trying to find his library for years, but it never has been turned up. I think scholars have assumed that he had, a working knowledge of Boccaccio and Chaucer and the Greek, Homer, and but no one's ever found the sort of books that he would have had, because presumably they would have been annotated, and there's very few letters of his, and we have very few documents of him. There is a theory, which I think is quite plausible, that it would have been destroyed in the Great Fire of London, which I think it's quite convincing, actually, that argument. You can imagine that might have happened, unless, of course, he brought it home to Stratford, in which case no one's. The other thing that no one's ever found is that in his will he left Judith a silver bowl, and apparently people have been searching for the silver bowl for hundreds of years and trying to find it, but no one ever has. So if anyone's got a silver bowl that looks like it might belong to Shakespeare, please let them know. But in terms of surprises, I don't know. I mean, to be honest, actually, it was also surprising. I think what I tried to do more than anything was to not, mostly for my own sake, really, was to not approach it as a historical novel, with capital H, capital N. I think that would have I would have felt too nervous about that. I tried to approach it as I would have done any other novel. And I think what's interesting to me, and I started reading a lot of other historical books and sort of feeling my way. And the ones that I really loved are the ones that wear their history very lightly. One of the novels, which I think is so brilliant, is Patrick DeWitt's The Sisters Brothers. I don't know if you've ever read that.
I love that book.
Oh God, it's so brilliant, honestly. And I read it again and again when I was writing Hamlet, because I thought, how does he create the idea? We know that this is, say, 100, 150 years ago, but he doesn't mention anything. There's no mention of, I don't know, clothing or cups, or I don't know, all those things which a lot of historical novelists kind of, I think what I found difficult about some historical fiction is that is there's a sense with some writers that they want to show you that they've done all their research. They are determined that every single detail about Bakelite or old telephones, or whatever their subject is. And I think that's fine, but I think, I don't know. I think what I discovered actually in writing the book, I think, and I'm sure, I don't know if you find this, Brando, when you're writing, but everything you write, you have a huge learning curve about something. It's all, there's so much you need to know, and you learn. But I think that's one of the things I love most about writing. But certainly with this one, I learned that, in order to create, say, a scene in an Elizabethan parlour, I needed to know so much. I needed to know what the floors were made of. I needed to know what the walls looked like, what the windows were, what they were wearing, what the clothing was made of, what was next to their skin, how their hair was. But actually, when you come to write the scene, you need to make sure you leave out 98% of it, or of all that information, because otherwise, your narrative gets very, very leaden with all this detail. And I don't think it's the sort of opposite of all the things my maths teachers used to say to me. They used to say, show your workings. I think of the historical novel, you don't want to show your workings. You need to get rid of it. So, but honestly, there was so much, so many surprises. One of my favorite ever Tudor facts, because actually while I was writing Hamnet, my my children limited me to, I was only allowed one Tudor fact per day. And that was over dinner time, and I was only allowed to say one, and then I was not allowed to talk about it ever again. But my favourite Tudor fact, which I'm going to share with you, is that Tudor sheep in Elizabethan England were half the size of sheep today.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness. I mean, so
wouldn't you just love one of those little tiny sheep?
A little teacup sheep. It would be, oh my gosh.
I really want one.
I mean, oh my gosh. And now I'm going to have to try really hard not to quiz you on Tudor facts, because I am a bit of a history obsessive. And I could talk about the Tudors all day, and why I think they were like the Kardashians of their time, but I won't get into that. I guess my next question is, I want to ask about the point of view of the novel, because you have somehow created this incredible roving eye of a novel. So much of the novel takes place on the day, that Judith gets ill with the plague, and then horrible things happen thereafter. And so much of the novel happens in those hours. But at the same time, you manage to show us everything that's happening in the town. And then we get these great tracks of the characters' histories. And so we understand everything that has happened to bring the characters to that particular moment in time, to that bedroom. And so I'm just curious, how? And how did you come to the point where you needed to narrate the novel from the perspective of fleas? Also, the grandchildren of the fleas that brought the plague on the boat. I mean, I was so blown away by the technical mastery of what you do with point of view in this novel, because it's unlike anything I've read before. It's just so, it slides in and around in place and time, and it's almost as though we're living the characters' entire histories with them in one breath. It's phenomenal. So as a writer, how did you do it? And did you just know you were going to, or was it something that you had to build your way to?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know about you, Brenda, but I'm not much of a planner in life or in fiction, actually. I have talked to other writers who say that they will meticulously plan each and every chapter and each and every plot turn before they even start writing, but that's really not me, and I'm guessing not you, because you're nodding your head. So I think I quite, obviously I set out with the idea that I was going to write about the life and death of Hamlet and the making of Hamlet. But I mean, originally I conceived the book as a kind of ghost story. I thought that actually Hamlet was going to come back and haunt the family, which even saying that makes me feel full of horror, because I realized pretty rapidly that was not gonna fly. And also, in a sense, I think what was more what was more cutting for me, or the idea that was more cutting, was that actually if he doesn't come back, if they can't find him and they're looking for him after he's died, but there's no communication, you know, the lines have been cut. And that, to me, seemed more poignant and more interesting in the kind of wish fulfillment aspect of the play Hamlet, which of course, you know, the ghost is the father and the son is alive, and they do communicate with each other. But I mean, you know, I think partly, you know, I was partly writing a book which was based on fact. You know, I mean, it was so, you know, creating the first half of the book, I became very attached to my Hamlet, you know, obviously because my Hamlet is fictional, and I think it's always important to remember that there was a real Hamlet, Shakespeare, and even though it's been a long time, he's still buried in that churchyard. So I became very attached to my fictional Hamlet, and I really wanted him to live. I did not want him to die. I did not want, you know, to have to write a scene where he leaves, but I knew that I had to, you know, I knew that in order to honor the story and honor the facts, and there is that entry in the Stratford-upon-Avon parish registers that said he was buried, and I could not get around that. So in a sense, like, you know, I wanted and it's a difficult subject to write about, you know, and it's you know, I didn't want to overburden, in a sense, the narrative and also the reader, because even though most people probably know what happened, you know, people know the bones of the story, perhaps, and I think I can't even remember if it says it on the back of the book, but I don't think it's a spoiler to say that Hamlet dies. But in a sense, you needed otherwise it would have been, you know, to stay with one point of view or one very sort of in a sort of closely zoomed, you know, lens. It would have been too intense. It would have been too much. And particularly when I wrote the chapter about the flea, I had this, you know, the chapter which traces the path of the plague, the Black Death, all the way from a monkey in Alexandria, and it comes on a ship all the way to England in order to infect little Judith. In a sense, I remember when I reached that point, you know, I hadn't planned that chapter at all, and I sort of hadn't seen it coming in a way. But I remember when getting to that point in the book and feeling that I wanted to, you know, almost in a cinematic way, to pull the lens back, and I was interested in the global devastation of, I mean, it's weird to talk about this now, but the global devastation of that particular pandemic. You know, the more I read about it, the more horrifying, you know, the more horrified I was about the extent of it. You know, I read about, you know, present day accounts of, you know, contemporary accounts of what happened to people and how vicious this bacterium was. And, you know, there was one account of I think in the 14th century, in one particular outbreak of the Black Death, a quarter of the world's population were killed, and that's only in Europe and Asia. Absolutely. So in a sense, I wanted there to be a kind of sort of global sort of perspective of what this disease did to the world and how it spread. I mean, it is, it's weird talking about it now, obviously, because that chapter can look very different to the way it did when I wrote it. But yeah, so I thought experimenting with sort of a sort of close focus and then a larger focus seemed to me the way to I don't know, yeah, communicate this story a bit, and it just seemed to be the best way. I always think that stories will, you have to kind of trust the story in a sense. You've got to trust the narrative or trust the material, because I think it will find the shape it needs to be.
I think that's right. That's always been true of my own work. I go through these periods where I feel like I'm obsessing over it, and I'm like, why am I obsessing? It will be what it will be. It will find its most stable configuration.
I think it will. I once wrote a novel where I'd written about 20,000 words in the first person past tense, and it was only about that point where I just thought, no, this is all wrong. And I kept, every time I opened up my computer, I would write third person present tense, and eventually I just thought, well, you know, this is trying to tell me something. So I had to go back through all the 20,000 words, changing everything around, and that was a really dull fortnight, but it was worth it.
Yeah, I mean, I once wrote 20,000 words of a novel in third person past tense, and then started writing in present tense without realizing it. But I didn't do what you did because I was too lazy. I just left it. So that's why there's a tense change in real life. Yeah, I just left it. But eventually the book gave me an opportunity to sort of
look at that now.
yeah, but eventually the story just sort of gives you an opportunity to just sort of like close the seams up. And I'm like, it was all meant to be. before we go to the audience questions, I would kick myself if I did not ask you about this. So, pulsing through this novel is a sense of the uncanny. There's something so charged and heightened about everything in the book. And part of that is a function of your incredible, dexterous language. But there also seems to be, I don't know, like the characters seem to be in communion with something almost. And of course, there's Agnes and nature. And even Susanna seems to feel things before they happen or things like that. What is it about the uncanny that seemed to drive a lot of what's happening in the novel? Because it seems to me a novel about names, yes, but also it seems to be like a novel in which fate is very much present almost in every scene. The characters seem, I don't know. I felt somehow that I was watching the fates spin their threads and then snip them in every scene of the book.
I think probably the uncanny sense of it all, or the second sight sense of it, which I think is sort of, there's a kind of ambiguity about Agnes's powers. I think there are people in Stratford who believe that she does have second sight, and others who really don't. And I think I try to leave it ambiguous so people can make up their own mind. But actually, I have to say that came mostly from the plays. If you look at a lot of Shakespeare plays, there is a huge amount of prophecy and second sight and superstition. I'm thinking of Macbeth or Julius Caesar. There's an awful lot of kind of portents and prophecies and augurs. And I do think, I think what interested me, I had no idea when I started researching the book. I actually knew absolutely nothing, I should say, before I started about the 16th century and that period in history. I never studied it at school. And I was really astonished actually about how strict a society it was. It was actually illegal not to go to church once a week. If you failed to turn up to church on Sunday, you got fined and you got summoned to court. And in fact, John Shakespeare, William's father, this happened to him several times because he failed to turn up. And there were all sorts of weird laws about what you were allowed to wear and what you were allowed to eat, and in your social class about what you could eat on certain days. It's extraordinary. I had no idea that it was that it was like that. And women had to cover their hair as soon as they were married. They wore these big sort of things, a bit like sort of nuns' wimples, these coifs. Mm-hmm. And so it seemed to me quite a repressive society. But, I refuse to believe that even though that society was arranged like that everybody was conforming and the women sat at home and did their embroidery and they were happy to do that. Obviously underneath this kind of crust of suppression, there was a huge amount of, turmoil and rebellion, and I really liked the idea that Agnes did not fit. Maybe she did go to church once a week, maybe everybody did, and they chucked their little coin into the plate. But I think, within those, everybody was doing whatever they want. And I think, naturally, I think they were more tied to the natural world, the natural cycles, and also to kind of superstition, and sort of pagan rituals, I think, much more than our society was. So I wanted to communicate that idea of subversion inside a society that was very sequestered.
Yeah. And I've always thought that like the more repressive the society, the more superstitious it is. Like those two things seem like they must go together in all ways and all forms.
They feed off each other, don't they?
I think so. I'm thinking about Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, right? Another novel suffused with the uncanny about Puritans and that so incredibly superstitious. And I think that the book is so brilliant on that score, the way that, I don't know, everybody's got their own little, ooh, 'tis an ill omen, don't go outside today, almost. It's fantastic. I really loved it. I won't hog all of the questions, so I'll let the audience, we have so many, they love this book. How important was research in historical? Oh, well, we already sort of touched on that. But this one's interesting. So you talked a little bit about how when you do research, you've got to leave 98% of that out. So then what were some of the calculations that go into that? What to leave out when you're sort of drawing on research?
Well, I think I only try to put things, I think the interesting thing the thing that I tried to communicate always with this is that although their lives were so different to ours, you know, and so alien and so distant in a lot of ways, that actually I don't really think the human heart and the human spirit has changed that much, you know, underneath the sort of superficial trappings of our clothes and our society. We are the same people, you know. I mean, I read such a lot actually about, you know, I think what I always found sad actually, whenever Hamnet was mentioned in any works of scholarship or biography, is that his death was always wrapped up in statistics about child mortality in the 16th century. And the kind of implication was that actually it wasn't really that big of a deal if a child died, because so many of them died that, you know, people were half expecting it, you know. And I found that really, it was like a punch to the gut, because I just refuse to believe that at any point in history, anywhere in the world, it's anything less than catastrophic if you have to bury your child. I just refuse to believe it. And I refuse to believe that it didn't have an impact on him. You know, I mean, I've actually read very respected scholars saying, you know, it's impossible to guess, you know, we can't really guess what the effect of Hamlet's death on William was. And I feel like saying, well, I can. I think he was probably absolutely devastated, like anybody else would be, you know. So I think it was more, that was the most important thing to me. These people were human. That yes, they wore clothes different to us and they ate different things, but underneath they're flesh and blood, just like we are.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. That's so good. So good. This is from Banuta. I'd like Maggie to comment on her own experience of theater. Has she ever been on stage, friends on stage, or mainly experienced it as a spectator?
I'm very much a spectator. I was never one of those kids who wanted to go on stage. Actually, I had, from all my childhood, my adolescence, I had the most horrific stammer. So it would have been my worst nightmare to go on stage. But no, I've loved watching, particularly Shakespeare on stage, good productions. And in fact, I'm so excited. Only this morning, I realised that the Globe Theatre in London, the new Globe Theatre, is open again. So I've just booked tickets to see The Tempest in the summer. So I cannot wait. It's been so long. And of course, the Globe Theatre is open air. So, you know, restrictions don't apply. So I'm really excited about that.
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's going to be so good. I'm so jealous. We got a couple of questions about the scene in which Hamnet and Judith lie down together on Judith's sickbed. And we've talked a little bit already about the uncanny and its role, its sort of ambiguous presence in the story. And so, you know, people would like to, I don't know, just hear you talk a little bit about that scene where Hamnet chooses to try to, you know, sort of step in for his sister.
Well, I have to say that trope comes directly again from the plays. I mean, I should say that I didn't want to, I was really conscious that I didn't want to write a novel that you have to have a working knowledge of Shakespeare to enjoy or to relate to. I wanted to write the kind of book that actually, if you've never read any Shakespeare at all, it does not matter one bit. But there are sort of certain allusions to his plays, certainly, that they're there if you want to see them, and it doesn't matter if you don't. But certainly the boy and girl twins changing places is it's a very strong motif in a lot of Shakespeare's work, particularly heartbreakingly in Twelfth Night, which was the play, the Globe Theatre anyway dates that he wrote after Hamlet. You know, it's often quite difficult to date the plays and exactly when he wrote them, but the Globe Theatre, who I think is probably a pretty good authority, dates Twelfth Night a year after Hamlet, which was 1601, Twelfth Night 1602. And of course, the play Twelfth Night is about a boy and girl twins who at the beginning of the play are separated and they each think the other one is dead. And then the play, for the length of the following acts, that is played as a comedy, you know, and as a kind of love story. And they dress up the girl dresses up in boy clothes, and she gets constantly mistaken for the boy twin, and they fall in love with the wrong people, and there's a whole kind of gender swap thing going on. And then at the end of the play, they are reunited, magically reunited, and they both fall upon each other, and they say, "I didn't realize, I thought you were dead, and here you are." You know, which, if you read that play through the lens of Shakespeare's own boy and girl twins, it's absolutely heartbreaking, because, you know, again, if you're thinking about the kind of wish fulfillment aspect of writing, you know, obviously he was thinking that wouldn't it be wonderful if my twins could be magically reunited, and they swap places and then they swap back and then they are reunited again. So I was just borrowing that trope for this, and I used it for that scene in particular because, you know, I was obviously we know that Hamlet is the one who dies, but sorry, I'm not crying, and I don't have COVID. I shouldn't be coughing these days, but yeah. So it was just a trope that I borrowed from the plays to put back into the thing, because I mean, I think it's so obvious that Shakespeare is thinking about his own boy and girl twins when he writes about boys and girl twins in his work, which, you know, constantly reoccurs.
Yeah, oh, it's so devastating. It's so, I will say that as the novel was coming to an end, it was like, but certainly Hamlet's gonna come back, right? Like certainly it's all gonna be a dream and she's gonna leave that production of Hamlet and like her son's gonna be in the street at dusk, right? Like of course. And of course, like that's not how that's not how history works, but it was, I mean, it is just like so heartbreaking, the sort of final totality of that act. And you realize what it is. Hamnet himself realizes what he's doing when he takes that on for his sister. I mean, it's just, oh my gosh. I could tell you a million different ways that this book is amazing and it broke my heart, but I won't do that. Instead, I'll ask you this question from Anonymous. How difficult was it to write Hamnet's death plus the family's moments of mourning as a mother yourself?
It was very difficult, actually. Yeah, and I really dreaded it. When I was coming up to that point in the book, I was sort of kept shying away from it, and I kept thinking, you know, I should probably go back and fix chapter 1. I should probably go back and redraft chapter 3. I kind of really put it off for as long as I possibly could. And actually, I couldn't write those scenes in the house where my children live. I had to write them outside in the garden. So I wrote them in a kind of potting shed. And it wasn't a kind of nice, posh, you know, garden office. It was a really disgusting, spidery shed, which has actually since blown down in a gale. And I would sit in there, and I had to do it in sort of 15 or 20-minute bursts. And then I would have a little walk around the garden, and then I'd go in and have another. So, I mean, they were some of the most difficult things I've ever written, not in a technical sense, but just in the place you have to go and the things you have to imagine. And also I hated doing it because at this point, you know, in the process of the project, Hamlet felt like my child, you know, he felt like one of my children. And actually one of the reasons I've put off writing this book for so long, and the main reason why I put off writing this book for so long is that I couldn't write it until my own son was past the age of 11. Couldn't do it because I have a son and 2 daughters like Shakespeare. Their birth order is different, but I couldn't do it. And I kept thinking that I would write this book, and then I would get closer and I think, no, I can't. I'm doing my own boy as part. He's now a 6-foot 17-year-old, so luckily, not that there was a huge risk of him getting the Black Death.
Oh, that's so.
But no, you can't be too careful.
Never too careful. I mean, life is full of strange resonances. It's very mysterious out there. This will be the last question. A couple of people have asked about Agnes and nature, and we've talked a little bit about it, but I think people would love to hear you talk a little bit more about why you chose to make Agnes a bit of an herbalist and where those facets of her character came from.
Well, I have to say, you know, one of the things that I was interested in terms of creating their marriage is that I wanted this idea that they had this partnership, that it was a kind of exchange. You know, she's been so criticized. I've read people saying that she was stupid, that she was ignorant, that she was illiterate. I've actually read quite a few people saying that she was ugly, which is really weird because there's one sketch of her in existence. And she's actually very good looking. She's got this very sort of heart-shaped face with high cheekbones. She looks bears a very striking resemblance to the actress Saoirse Ronan, who I think we can all probably agree is quite far from being ugly. So just that she's attracted all this criticism. And I was just looking, you know, one of the things that's fascinating about Shakespeare is the enormous reach and fetch of his knowledge, you know, the breadth of subjects that he uses in his plots and in his metaphors. And I was just thinking, you know, I read somewhere in one of the books about that it was the woman of the household who would have every household would have cultivated their own medicinal garden, and it would have been a woman's job in the house to sort of treat minor ailments at home. And actually, I did, in the research for this, I did plant my own Elizabethan medicinal garden.
Oh, wow.
And then I learned how to make it into cures. In fact, for Agnes, I did all kinds of things. I learned falconry. I went down to the Scottish borders and I met this very cool falconer who let me fly her kestrel. So I learned that. I also went on archaeological digs along the River Thames. And I particularly went to digs. I did a dig just where the original Globe Theatre had been. And in the silt there, in the River Silt, I found loads and loads of brass pins, which obviously were used for costumes to keep their ruffs on or to keep their wigs on. So I have a whole dish of brass pins from the Globe Theatre. And I kind of think Shakespeare must have touched one of these, definitely. It would have been pinning on his costume. So that, in that sense, for Agnes particularly, I didn't find sort of book research that useful. For her, I did a lot more physical research. I wanted to kind of get my hands dirty to understand the labor of her life, the labor involved in her life. But actually the herbology was suggested to me by Hamlet, and in particular the scene where Ophelia has gone mad and she's handing plants to people, and all those plants are a very specific cure for something she sees in there, for a flaw she perceives in their character. So it's obvious that when Shakespeare wrote that scene that he had a very informed knowledge of the sort of contemporary uses of plants. And I just thought, well, where did he get that from? Maybe he got it from her.
Oh my gosh. I love that. I am now accepting this as the only real canon and only historical record of fact. That is now.
Please don't tell Shakespeare scholars that. I'm sure they'd be probably gnashing their teeth.
Maggie, I think we could take them. I think me and the army of your fans, we could take them and rewrite the record. I think we could do it. We could.
Different Shakespeares. We all have our own interpretations.
Indeed. Yeah, I think, but thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you for answering all my curiosities, Maggie.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you so much for me, and thank you so much for everyone for coming and listening. And it was so great to meet you, Brandon. I hope it will be in person next time.
Fingers crossed.
Thank you both so much for such a fantastic discussion and fantastic event.
Well, thank you. It was a blast.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Bye.